This session is sponsored by the Galicia Group and their new library call service. Do you have patrons with no internet access and only a phone connection? Library Call gives you the tools you need to provide critical services that everyone can benefit from. Get text and phone-based dial-a-story, resource hotlines, local COVID updates, community calendar, library occupancy information, and much more. Check out librarycall.org from the Galicia Group now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sade Dozan. I've been in the nonprofit industry as a public administrator for nearly 15 years. During this time, I've transitioned from a direct service individual. I was a community-based service provider, a counselor, an organizer, essentially like many of you, someone who implements programs. I went from being a public administrator to a fundraising specialist, concentrating on grant writing with a special focus on community-based and grassroots efforts. I've worked for organizations with budgets as big as 60 million and as small as less than 10,000. And to sum me up, I love nonprofits. I am an advocate. I truly believe in the power that community-driven solutions have, and I am motivated by elevating the voices of community leaders like you. So, as a community leader, you'll likely wear many hats. I know that I certainly did, from program support to advocate and housekeeper to resource builder, which is what this workshop is about. And I want to ensure that we make this a space, digital or not, where you learn how to strengthen that special fundraising arm, that you walk away with something called funder glasses that really place a lens on how to position your community institution to receive funds that support your mission and your programming. Libraries are so important, and I want to make sure that with all your hats, you fully understand some of the things that you might have to do within resource building. You'll have to draft outreach letters, become a grant writer, and as always, a spokesperson for your institution. There are many buckets from which to build sustainability and funds for organizations. The first of which will be what we spend this workshop on, is the institutional bucket. And within that, we have foundations, corporate giving arms, and even local and small businesses. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But I also want to make sure that you're also aware that there's buckets for individuals. You have small and medium level donors, which are usually gifts that are under $500 or $5,000, depending on your scale of your library. And then there are major donors, which can be donors that are 1,000 or 10,000, depending on the type of library you're operating. But there's also donor advised funds and even small family foundations. And family foundations, although yes, they are a foundation, are bucketed under individuals because they're usually operated by a small cohort of people, usually family members, really one or two people that are making the major decisions. Therefore, we reach out to them like we would individuals. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well, but I just want to make sure that we're framed within our buckets. Another bucket of funding are government funds. And these government funding models, such as from the Department of Education or your local municipality, could really be anything. They could be within local initiatives, state initiatives, federal initiatives, and all of those buckets would fall within the overarching government frame. And there's also a fee for service model, which are things that operate kind of like a social enterprise, which are really small businesses that sell goods or items or services, wherein proceeds then go back to further your organization's work. So there are so many different ways to get funding. And this workshop in particular will focus on the institutional support and fundraising component of the fuller resource building model. I do want to address that government grants, such as federal, state, or local municipalities, school district, counties, will often post calls for nonprofit social good organizations and sometimes libraries to complete their desired work. This also technically makes them an institutional bucket of funding as they focus on moving forward specific projects such as literacy initiatives, in school or out of school program implementation, human services, so on. However, these grants are sourced from public funds through the government's budget, so I won't be diving too deeply into them as they require a different approach and than most individual funders. I will note that they are highly competitive, but they often have a high award amount, usually around 100,000 or 500,000. That's not really unrealistic depending on the project. And government grant opportunities typically require extensive attachments, stakeholder letters of support, evidence based data, and proof of prior success before applying. They require civic good and social impact with data heavy evidence based solutions. But I want to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit more about what we're all here for, which are foundations, corporations, and small businesses within this resource building component. They typically have a much shorter turnaround than the government comparison I just gave you. And they take much less time to develop on average. And they are great for interim projects, immediate needs, and even can support some of your library's long-term strategic goals. So each bucket requires a different approach, shifting tones in the way you convey information, and the understanding that there are many libraries, nonprofits, and community based organizations that also need resources. It is an extreme sport, and within this, your overarching characteristics that are really going to help is patience and diligence. And remember to never stop asking. We have to really keep pushing. So let's talk more about institutional support. So first, we have foundations. And like I mentioned, foundations are private institutions that aren't funded with public dollars like taxes, but more so single sources such as wealthier individuals or affluent families. Their giving programs typically require far fewer attachments and have a simpler process on average, distribute far fewer funds than their government counterparts, and their focus areas vary. They are wide and far reaching, from funding programmatic support for literacy initiatives, capacity development needs for leadership training, and even technology supplies like computers and iPads. When you think about a foundation and the tone you want to use when addressing them in any sort of written pieces that you're giving out, you really want to think impact and depth, long-term solutions, and really focusing on the fact that foundations are most likely to fund scaling and pilot initiatives, as well as really your overall general expenses. They are one part of the institutional triangle, I guess. So the next one that we have are corporations. And corporations like Coca-Cola or State Farm, really any brand name that you can think of, any major brand name, are most likely will have some sort of private institution that sets up like a philanthropic arm, which distributes grants from a percentage of their company's earnings. So we're thinking very large corporations. Those corporations sometimes call their philanthropic arms corporate responsibility giving. So that's another name that you might run into. And these grant making focus areas typically are concentrated in communities where the company's employees work. And often they prefer that organizations or libraries or anyone that's applying have employee engagement, such as volunteering or sitting on an advisory board. When engaging with corporations, you have to think about your scope and reach. Corporate funders are most likely to fund local and employee engagement programs. So you really want to think about how you would make room, if there isn't any yet, for outside support, volunteer programs, like even if it's like painting a library wall, whatever it is that engages with the employees, even if it's not necessarily directly within the program or operation that you're looking to get funding in. You really want to think about employee engagement, and that's ultimately key for corporations. Another thing that makes up our three-pronged institutional support that we're going to be talking about is small businesses. And small businesses are those that are in your neighborhood and not the big chains. They're often started by key stakeholders in the community who live there and have strong ties to the communities. They are truly invested in their well being. And their approach, well, the approach to get funding from these businesses is like a blend between an individual donor engagement strategy and a more formal institution approach. So they're kind of like a hybrid. And they are often, and this is small businesses in general, they're often more likely to contribute in kind to your library, like donating t-shirts or food, technology, or equipment than necessarily a direct check. Sometimes small businesses will write a check. However, regardless, they're important to engage as key stakeholders in your community. So, for institutions at large, written collateral is key. And I'm throwing a photo of a dog in here just to keep your attention because I know that it's hard to do this in Zoom and also to not see my face. But I want to illustrate a point. Quality collateral gets people's attention. It When I say collateral, I mean proposals, written information, brochures, anything that you're handing out to help communicate to a funder, to a potential funder, the language that really surrounds the desire for your community's evolution. So it has to be captivating. And this collateral should also articulate how you are able to provide a solution to gaps in services and how your organization or library is working to solve larger systemic issues like literacy or illiteracy, actually, and economic disparities, and what those strategic steps are. And all of this has to include how these issues that you're addressing are within the funder's interest and scope. So, this is how you justify alignment. And there are a few steps within this process, but the overarching theme is that collateral plus alignment equals a strong positioning for a funding award, which is all you can really do. You can draft the best document you can position yourself to really be within the line of exactly what the institutional funders guidelines point to, and that's really what you can do. We'll talk a little bit, and I say positioning for a funding award because I really want to underline how competitive the market is. And this isn't to discourage you. It's just that even if all the stars align, there's no guarantee in institutional funding. But the following tips and best practices will position you for the most promising submissions and requests. So let's review the types of written collateral pieces and learn or refresh, depending on where you are in your resource building process, what a few of the key terms are. So first we have letter of inquiry. Letters of inquiry or intent, also known as LOIs by the acronym, are a quick way for libraries to introduce themselves to a funder and also to open up a conversation about how much money they need and why. If a funder likes what they see in an LOI, usually they'll extend an invitation to you to submit more details about what you want them to fund. And they are, well, usually this second invitation is done through a proposal or application. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I want to talk about also a concept note, which is a very important piece of collateral for libraries and organizations to have internally, but also it can face externally. Concept notes are typically reserved for funders that are familiar with your work, maybe connected through your network or have already funded you previously. And these concept notes present a larger project or concept that will be addressed through a cohort of funding. It's typically shorter than a full proposal, usually 2 to 3 pages, sometimes more, and it is nonprofit formatted versus LOIs, which are typically foundation requested formats based on their preferred requirements. So think LOI is external documents that are driven by the foundation, and then a concept note is something that your library would develop based around kind of something that you want to do. So a series of initiatives or an overarching theme or scope of work would have a concept note. So that's something that you want to develop a cohort of funding around. And when I say cohort of funding, I mean this from the idea of a budgeting perspective. For example, if you want to launch a series of community workshops on financial literacy best practices with a component for adults and also a component for teens over the course of 12 months, you may need to bring in experts on this topic, pay for additional technology equipment, and provide refreshments during each workshop. And this means you would need funds for all of these items, like honorariums for speakers, funds for projectors, iPads, food. Um, and you would have to create a more comprehensive budget that may need multiple funders. So that multiple funders, that list, this is the idea behind a cohort of funding. You utilize the written collateral pieces to apply for multiple pots of funding from multiple institutions. For foundations in particular, the main form of communicating a funding request is through proposals or grant applications, which are a formal submission to a grant giving institution to request funding. The totality of the proposal or the application is often an expansion on your concept note, which could be internal, external, depending on the relationship you have with the funder. However, these proposals really focus on core components that appear in almost every application, no matter who the funder is. They, like, for example, detailing the need, the organization experience, project scope, timeline, deliverables, evaluation process. These are all things that a funder and most funders want to know. However, each funder has specific requirements, and proposal and grant applications vary in accordance with each funder's specifications. So we will touch on the typical proposal narrative framework in a second or a few minutes, but I just want to highlight that appeal letters are a special caveat to all of this. They're typically used to communicate overarching needs and often go to individuals. This is primarily how you appeal to small, local, and community-based institutions, or really, sorry, community-based businesses. So those small businesses that we were talking about. Small businesses typically don't need a letter of inquiry or concept note or a formal proposal. This piece of collateral, this appeal letter, should be emotional but brief. It should illustrate the needs and be rooted in the direct steps your library is taking to solve for community issues and the use of funding. But we're really thinking like 1 to 2 pages max. The purpose of this piece of collateral is to ensure that the small business owner just gets to hold on to whatever it is that you have discussed with them. You can send this via mail, you can drop it off depending on what your socially distant situation may look like in a month or a few months or a year, I'm not sure. But I want to spend more time talking about the components of a proposal. I just wanted to take that quick detour over to that appeal letter. I mean, I always advise anyone looking to fundraise to really flush out and outline their concept and need for funding, which could include a 12-month scope of work or a short-term project through a grant template. This way, you can build a full 12-month scope of work or short-term project through a grant template. This way, you can build an LOI or an appeal letter or funder-specific proposal from that document. So I always encourage folks to develop a really like a concept note. Just write down all the ideas you have, flush it out, start making connections with what your need is and the solution, and kind of build around from there. And just one more thing around, maybe a couple of more things around the appeal letters. I know I'm jumping back and forth. It's really because I'm doing a comparison between the proposals, which are the more formal study, the more formal way of approaching an institution, and appeal letters, which focus on that small business, individual focused approach for resource building. So here are, let's kind of dig into the small business approach before we go back to the formal grant proposal application. So I've mentioned it a few times, and I want to make sure that you further really understand the different tones needed to address different institutions. So within the you first want to identify your small business. You want to reach out to them, illustrate the need in their community. What is your library doing to provide a solution? And like I mentioned before, phone calls or in person when possible and safe are always encouraged. Then after you've identified this business that you feel like may have a good reputation for giving in the community or that you may personally know would likely be interested in supporting, then you want to give them an appeal. So appeals are requests for funds, usually written physically or digitally, either through soft, which are kind of like implied asks or requests, versus a hard ask, which is a direct or explicit request. So really, depending on your relationship, you might go for a hard ask or a soft ask. When you think about soft versus hard, think about the difference between the ask being like, consider giving generously, which would be a soft ask, versus please give $5 or $500. Donation appeals can be distributed in many formats. You can create an appeal over social media or e-blast or hard mail. However, they all follow the same format. We want to do X, so please help us by donating. And then you really want to underline your need and direct the business to join you through a call for action. Calls to action further the concept of we want to do XYZ, but it simply replaces or underlines the request with the step the audience or the reader or the small business leader can take to support that outcome, such as sign a petition or tweet, rally. Calls to action should motivate and inspire the reader to support your outcomes and the appeal should really underline the action of donation. They kind of go hand in hand, and depending on your relationship with the business owner, what exactly it is that you're requesting, you have to figure out the exact tone that your library should be using to approach that specific individual that represents the small business. When you approach a small business, you want to ensure that you are direct and figure out what the explicit ask is. Um, it may be appropriate to ask them for direct amount. I usually encourage organizations to just put the direct amount in there. We need to raise $500,000 by June 20th, 2021. Will you give 200, 2,000? The amount is based on two things, and this goes across all institutions, really how much you need and what they may have the capacity to give. Mom and pop shops, it varies. It really depends on the type of businesses, really the type of revenue that they're generating, which is may not be something that is publicly available, which is why I really think about small businesses in the institutional bucket, because it certainly is a business and it's an institutional approach, but it does have that kind of nuanced, personal, one-on-one, custom appeal that you make based on the individual. So we will certainly talk about prospect research across multiple buckets within the institution, in institutions such as foundations and corporations. And we will also talk about understanding giving patterns, but I wanted to make sure we took that appeal detour before digging into a proposal template, and then we'll go over to research methods. So if you can recall, because we just took that detour on the appeal language and the small business approach, I mentioned that there are a few core components of a proposal template or a grant application that really show up no matter what the major funder is. Both corporations and foundations alike are interested in really 8 main parts. The first of these is the statement of need. And this section is an evidence-based approach to outlining the community's need. You're just stating the need. It's usually a couple paragraphs depending on the funder, but that's one part that you certainly need is the evidence-based citation, the research, the data that proves whatever it is that you're trying to solve needs to be solved. And your mission and vision is the section that really conveys your library specific goal, your library's really your guiding light. So your mission, your vision, and states that your solution is key for the community need. And then you have your organization history and leadership section. And this is essentially a built-in response that explains what makes your library unique, why you've outlined this particular need of work, and how it dovetails with the work that you in your library has historically done. What qualifications your specific team has to really carry out the scope of work that you're going to be presenting in your project description. And the project or projects, depending on really how many you have to outline, is a full scope of your programming and services that will be accomplished with the funds that you will be requesting. And this section should also have a little blurb around your population description. So the specific community that your library is within and their unique values and their unique needs and kind of their demographics. And then another component, I guess really the 5th component of a proposal template is an objectives and goals section. So these are SMART, which is known as SMART is an acronym for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. So these are SMART goals that outline your plans for the next year. And you also want to make sure that you have a justification through the evaluation section that explains to a funder your library's capacity to oversee the project and the deliverables that you are outlining in your objectives and goals, really how you will measure this. What is your method of reviewing your impact and assessing that you were in fact successful? Speaking of impact, I always recommend really outlining separately in a community impact section, um, which summarizes the overall scope that your library has been able to accomplish thus far. Kind of like it's a little bit different than the organization history and leadership section because that says who the individuals guiding and historically what the institution has done in the community. But the community impact is what has occurred as a result of the operations within the community. So what you have done currently, and then also what you will do in the long run, given this program and services are funded. And then the last section is kind of a partnership section, a use of funds section. It's really like a catch-all conclusion that includes the impact of engagement overall. It summarizes the request and underlines the need for potential funder support. This should also include any potential volunteer opportunities or requests from the funders, such as promotion, branding, etc. I mean, ultimately, grant making is a tool to secure sustainability and one component of diversified funding for libraries. So, by ensuring that you have fully fleshed out a concept with a budget, which is very, very important, um, and that these things are informed by the needs and solutions that you've outlined throughout the above components, you are better prepared to work towards successful grant submission and will be able to communicate clearly your funding needs. So libraries, just like nonprofits and community-based organizations, really need to fundraise. It is important to work on diversified approaches. And in addition to a blend of government support and individual donors, institutional support at these multiple identified levels, foundations, corporations, and small businesses, will really help build the sustainability needed to strengthen the resources within your community. And just to make sure that you're all still with me, here's a photo of a dog reading. So how do you find these leads? Where are they? Where are these funding giving institutions hidden? Well, the small businesses are in your community. Like I mentioned, sometimes the old faithful approach of leveraging your network, making phone calls and writing letters to businesses in your area is really your best bet as far as the small businesses go. A lot of these small business owners work directly in these locations and speaking to them directly about the needs and the goals of your library while providing them with a document such as an appeal letter that outlines the request and use of funds or in-kind contribution is really your best approach. For foundations, though, although you may be able to leverage your network, you will more than likely need more prospect researching, which takes time, energy, and definitely a strategy. There are prospect tools that support grant research needs. Specifically, they help identify institutional giving opportunities such as Instrumental or Candid, which was formerly GuideStar. And then there are a few like Grant Gopher that are free. But the research tools are out there, and many of them cost money, averaging anywhere between really upwards of $75 to $100 a month. There are some that are a little bit cheaper, like Foundation Center. You can get a package for about $50 a month. But all of this is actually behind the reasoning behind a diversified blend of individual and institutional support. You can utilize your individual funds raised to build your organization's capacity and to fund your research to find bigger pots of funding and scale your community outreach, ensure repairs and building maintenance. All of this is possible. There are a few things that you need to keep in mind when doing prospect research, like always keep a detailed proposal tracking and research list. Even if you don't have a fancy database or extensive prospecting tools or software, an Excel list will do. And on this list should include the institution's name and the potential target ask, meaning how much are you going to ask them for. It should also include a proposal or letter of inquiry deadline, um, and also the difficulty of the application and the process, and any notes that are relevant to their areas of focus and previous grant making. The difficulty of the application is usually gauged by the number of hours it will take you to complete the requested documents if you're building from your proposal template. There's also the potential return on investment to consider when thinking about the difficulty or worthwhile of an application. The return on investment, or ROI, which is often expressed as a percent, is a calculation that states what you are getting in return for your efforts. Essentially, how much money will these efforts generate? So, your fundraising effort, your fundraising revenue, which are the funds and money that's generated by your efforts, um, over the level of investment that you are making in the fundraising process. And then there's also this also equals it's your fundraising expense. A few things to be considered. Um, a few things need to be considered and turned into a dollar value, such as time, which can likely easily be turned into an expense when you consider salaries or labor, but also in the fundraising expenses or the amount of literal funds you are spending on tools for prospecting. So there are a ton of calculators online to help estimate staff time, volunteer run causes, and how they all relate to opportunity costs, which on a very high level is what you will lose out on if you don't take the time to apply for this grant. What if you apply for a smaller grant instead of for example, instead of if you do 4 1,000 grants that will take 30 minutes to apply instead of one 4,000 grant request that will take 3 hours. Just kind of trying to figure out which makes the most sense. What's the likelihood of you getting one of the four versus the one? And maybe it'll take you less time to do 4 low-level grants, which might make more sense on your return on investment and increase your odds. When the investment is money out versus money in, and ROI is extremely easy to calculate since it's more of an apple to apple comparison. However, when the investment is time and resources, it can be difficult to quantify. There, however, these are necessary steps for you to take so that you can engage your level of your library's capacity, and then also your ability to carry out your institutional support funding pursuits. How much time would you put into the potential application? What is the rate of return? This helps you identify the difficulty level and evaluate whether this application is a strategic effort for your library given your capacity, and then prioritize your prospects based not only on deadlines, but ROI as well. Lastly, within your research, and this is especially important for your research list, you'll have to have a solid understanding of a foundation or corporation's field of interest, versus their giving pattern. So a field of interest is what it sounds like. It is the scope of work funders are interested in funding, usually defined in categories like literacy, technology, innovation, youth, families. These fields of interest sometimes have subcategories or fancy titles such as equity in hospitals or future of workers, which indicate special themes and concentrations. However, an institution's giving pattern shows how large, how frequent, or the scale of the investment the funders make within those sections. A funder can distribute funds across multiple fields of interest, but how deeply they give, such as 85% of their giving going towards healthy children and family versus research, and how much, meaning 1 million average grants versus 10,000 average grants, is the structure of their giving pattern. Understanding and ensuring that your project and proposal fit within both of these points ensures alignment. So, for most foundations, even if you don't utilize a major prospect tool, all of the information regarding their deadlines and their requirements, their fields of research, their fields of interest and their giving patterns can be found on their websites or digging through their 990s, their previous records. You just have to dig a little and take all of this with you. So prepare your collateral, research and learn your funder, and then apply. It really is about learning, refining, and growing. And that's the only way to ensure sustainability and scalability. Remember to always keep asking. So, once again, my name is Sade Dozan, and thank you so much for going on this journey with me. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about my services, you can reach me through my website, creatingcatalyst.com, or feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I'm always looking to strengthen my network and have an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for listening and hopefully learning. Best of luck.